The final chapter of Benito Mussolini's life unfolded with a brutality that matched the violent regime he had imposed upon Italy for over 2 decades. In the dying days of April 1945, as Allied forces closed in and partisan resistance erupted across northern Italy, the once mighty Deuce faced his most desperate hours that would end in summary execution and public humiliation that shocked even those who despised fascism: the collapse of the last stronghold by April 25, 1945. Mussolini's puppet Italian Social Republic was crumbling under the relentless advance of Allied forces and the coordinated uprising of Italian partisans. The man who had once commanded millions from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia now found himself trapped in Milan, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by most of his followers. The dream of a final Alpine redoubt, a last desperate stand in the mountains, had proven as illusory as the promises of fascist glory. The decision to flee came suddenly on the night of April 25th. Mussolini, accompanied by his devoted mistress Clara Petacci, her brother Marcello, and a handful of remaining loyalists, abandoned Milan under cover of darkness. Their destination was Switzerland, where the fallen dictator hoped to find political asylum and perhaps salvage something from the wreckage of his regime. The desperate flight north. Escape convoy that formed on April 26th presented a pathetic spectacle of defeated fascism attempting to merge with retreating German forces. Mussolini had arranged to join a German military convoy commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Otto Kuhn and SS Oberführer Fritz Birzer of the SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The convoy consisted of approximately 30 vehicles, trucks, automobiles, and motorcycles, carrying both German soldiers and fascist officials fleeing the Allied advance. Among the Italian passengers were Alessandro Pavolini, secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, Fernando Mezzasoma, Minister of Popular Culture, and other high-ranking officials who had remained loyal to Mussolini's final regime. To avoid recognition, Mussolini donned a Luftwaffe uniform complete with steel helmet, attempting to blend in among the retreating German troops. Clara Petacci, who had insisted on accompanying her lover to whatever fate awaited them, traveled in civilian clothes. The convoy's progress northward proved agonizingly slow as the roads clogged with retreating German units, civilian refugees, and advancing partisan columns. Multiple times they were stopped at improvised checkpoints, but German officers managed to negotiate passage by showing credentials or engaging in tense negotiations with local resistance fighters. As they passed through Como and other towns on April 26th, rumors began circulating about Mussolini's presence in the convoy. The fatal roadblock at Dongo Dawn broke on April 27, 1945, to reveal Lake Como shrouded in morning mist, a scene of natural beauty that would soon witness one of the most dramatic captures in modern history. The German convoy approached the village of Dongo on the northwestern shore of the lake. Unaware that Italian communist partisans of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade had established a roadblock ahead. The partisan unit, commanded by Pier Luigi Bellini delle Stelle and led in the field by Urbano Lazzaro, known by his nom de guerre Bill, had received intelligence that high-ranking fascists were attempting to escape to Switzerland. As the convoy approached the checkpoint, partisan fighters surrounded the vehicles and forced all occupants to dismount. The partisans quickly identified several fascist officials, including Pavolini and Mezzasoma, but initially failed to recognize the most important prize. Mussolini, still wearing his German uniform and helmet, remained in one of the trucks, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with his captors. However, Urbano Lazzaro's trained eye caught something suspicious about one of the supposed German soldiers who refused to speak and maintained an unnaturally submissive posture. Moving closer for inspection, Lazzaro peered beneath the steel helmet and recognized the unmistakable features of Benito Mussolini. The disguise that had fooled casual observers could not withstand close scrutiny. When confronted, Mussolini offered no resistance and allowed himself to be led away by the partisans. Shortly afterward, Clara Petacci was also identified and detained. Lazzaro later described the moment of recognition with chilling detail. His face was like wax and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. The night of decision following their capture, the partisans negotiated with the German officers commanding the convoy. The Germans demanded the release of their soldiers and the handover of all Italians in exchange for safe passage northward. After tense discussions, an agreement was reached. The German troops could continue toward Switzerland while all Italian fascists would remain as prisoners of the E. Partisans Mussolini and Petacci were taken to the local barracks in Dongo, where they spent part of the night of April 27-28. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on April 28th, Clara Petacci, who had requested to be reunited with her lover, was brought to join Mussolini. The fallen dictator now found himself confined with over 50 other fascist leaders and their families who had been captured in the convoy. As fighting continued in the area around Dongo, partisan commanders feared that fascist sympathizers might attempt a rescue operation. To ensure the security of their most valuable prisoners, they decided to move Mussolini and Petacci to a more secluded location. In the middle of the night, the couple was driven to a nearby farmhouse owned by the De Maria family, where partisan leaders believed they would be safer from any potential rescue attempts. Meanwhile, in Milan, socialist partisan leader Sandro Pertini announced Mussolini's capture on Radio Milano Libertà, with barely contained jubilation. The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancor and fear and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people so it can judge him quickly. We want this. Even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honor for this man, he would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog. The order to execute as dawn broke on April 28, 1945, the National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy had reached a fateful decision. Rather than risk a lengthy trial that might provide Mussolini with a platform for propaganda or allow for potential rescue attempts, they ordered his immediate execution. The task was assigned to Walter Audisio, a communist partisan operating under the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio. Audisio departed Milan early that morning, accompanied by Aldo Lampredi and other partisan fighters, carrying explicit orders to carry out the execution. Upon arriving in Dongo, they met with local partisan commander Bellini delle Stelle to arrange for Mussolini and Petacci to be handed over to them. The transfer was conducted with military efficiency. There would be no delays, no opportunities for escape, and no mercy for the man who had brought such suffering to Italy. The final journey, in the afternoon of April 28th, Audisio and his team drove to the De Maria farmhouse to collect their prisoners. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were told they were being moved to another location, though both likely understood the true nature of their final journey. They were placed in a vehicle and driven 20 kilometers south to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. The execution site chosen by the partisans was a narrow road called Via 24 Maggio, adjacent to the Villa Belmonte. The location was isolated enough to prevent interference while remaining accessible for the partisan execution squad. As the vehicle pulled up to the entrance of the villa, Mussolini and Petacci were ordered to exit and stand against the villa's wall. The moment of execution. What transpired in those final moments has been the subject of debate among historians, with different witnesses providing conflicting accounts of Mussolini's behavior and final words. Walter Audisio later claimed that Mussolini appeared cowardly and trembling in his final moments, while other witnesses suggested he maintained some measure of dignity. According to Audisio's account, he formally read out a sentence of death, though partisan Aldo Lampredi omitted this detail in his version of events. The most commonly accepted account suggests that Mussolini's final words were, "Aim at my heart," though this too remains disputed. Contemporary reports suggested he died shouting "No, no," as the firing squad prepared to shoot. At precisely 4:10 p.m. on April 28, 1945, Walter Audisio opened fire with a submachine gun borrowed from Michel Moretti after his own weapon had jammed. The burst of gunfire that followed ended the life of the man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades. Clara Petacci, who according to some accounts threw herself in front of Mussolini in a desperate attempt to shield him, was also killed in the fusillade. The execution was swift and brutal. A bullet penetrated Mussolini's skull through the left forehead and exited behind his right ear, destroying part of his brain. The man who had dreamed of creating a new Roman Empire lay dead on a country road, his blood mixing with the dirt of northern Italy. Audizio later described the execution with chilling detachment. "I had the impression of shooting not a man, but an inferior being." Mussolini trembled, exhibited no faith, and lacked any sense of dignity in his final moments. Whether this account accurately reflected Mussolini's final behavior or served as partisan propaganda to diminish his legacy remains a matter of historical debate. The journey to Milan following the executions, the bodies of Mussolini and Petacci were loaded onto a truck, along with the corpses of other fascist officials who had been shot in Dongo earlier that day. The grim convoy made its way south through the night toward Milan, the city where fascism had been born and where it would receive its final, humiliating burial. The decision to transport the bodies to Milan was both symbolic and practical. Milan had witnessed some of the worst atrocities of the fascist regime and German occupation, and partisan leaders believed the public display of Mussolini's corpse would provide closure for the Italian people, while demonstrating the definitive end of fascist rule. The horror of Piazzale. Loreto on the morning of April 29, 1945. The bodies arrived at Piazzale Loreto, a square in Milan that held particular significance for the resistance movement. Just months earlier, on August 10, 1944, German occupation authorities had publicly executed 15 Italian civilians at this very location in retaliation for partisan attacks. The executed resistance fighters had been left on display for days as a warning to the population. Now, in a moment of grim poetic justice, it was the fascist leaders who would be subjected to public humiliation at the same location. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and other executed fascists were hung upside down from the roof of an Esso petrol station in the square. The symbolism was unmistakable. Fascism itself was being turned on its head, displayed for all to see as a defeated and discredited ideology. What followed was a scene of almost medieval brutality that shocked even hardened observers. A crowd of more than 5,000 people gathered around the hanging corpses, venting decades of suppressed rage and humiliation. They kicked, spat upon, and otherwise desecrated the bodies, while photographers captured images that would become some of the most infamous of World War II. The crowd's fury was particularly focused on Mussolini's corpse. His bald head, pierced by the fatal bullet wound, became a target for stones and other projectiles thrown by the enraged Milanese. Brain matter that had once conceived grandiose dreams of empire now oozed onto the filthy pavement of the square. The final spectacle, as if the display were not complete enough, fate delivered one final fascist to the square that day. Achille Starace, former Secretary General of the Fascist Party, was recognized and arrested while living in Milan. Brought to Piazzale Loreto by partisan forces, he was shown Mussolini's hanging corpse, which he saluted in a final gesture of loyalty to his former leader. Moments later, Starace was executed by firing squad in front of the crowd, and his body was subsequently strung up alongside Mussolini's. American Colonel Charles Poletti, representing the Allied military government, was present during this execution and reportedly offered no objection to the proceedings. According to Walter Audizio's later testimony, Poletti's only comment was, "Okay, thanks bang," as Starace was shot before his eyes. Historical significance and aftermath. The brutal end of Benito Mussolini marked far more than the death of a single dictator. It symbolized the complete collapse of fascism in Italy and the approaching end of World War II in Europe. Within days of Mussolini's execution, German forces in Italy would surrender on May 2nd, followed by the general German capitulation on May 8, 1945. The manner of Mussolini's death, captured while fleeing in disguise, summarily executed and publicly humiliated, provided a stark contrast to his years of bombastic speeches and grandiose posturing. The man who had proclaimed himself the heir to Caesar's legacy died as a fugitive on a country road, his empire reduced to nothing more than bitter memories and traumatic wounds in the Italian national consciousness. Walter Audizio, the partisan who carried out the execution, would live with the consequences of that moment for the rest of his life. He became a symbol of the Italian resistance, but also faced legal challenges from Clara Petacci's family, who argued that her execution was unlawful since she was not a member of the fascist government. After lengthy legal proceedings, Audizio was ultimately acquitted in 1967 on the grounds that his actions constituted legitimate acts of war against occupying forces. The images of Mussolini's hanging corpse spread around the world, serving as both a warning to other dictators and a testament to the ultimate fate of those who choose the path of tyranny. For the Italian people, the sight of their former dictator reduced to a battered corpse provided a form of cathartic closure to more than 2 decades of fascist rule. Yet the brutality of those final hours, the summary execution, the public desecration of corpses, the medieval savagery of the crowd, also raised uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the thin line between liberation and barbarism. The New York Times, in its coverage of the events, described Mussolini's end as a fitting end to a wretched life. But even supporters of the Allied cause were disturbed by the graphic nature of the dictator's final humiliation. Legacy of the Final Hours, the story of Mussolini's last hours, serves as a powerful reminder of the ultimate fate that awaits those who build their power on violence, oppression, and the suffering of others. The man who had once commanded millions from his balcony died alone and friendless, abandoned by his people and despised by history. His final desperate flight, disguised in enemy uniform and hiding among retreating soldiers, embodied the cowardice and moral bankruptcy that had always lurked beneath fascism's theatrical displays of strength. Clara Petacci's fate remains perhaps the most tragic element of the entire story. Her genuine devotion to Mussolini, however misguided, led her to share his final hours and ultimate destruction. Her decision to throw herself between Mussolini and his executioners, if the accounts are accurate, represented perhaps the only moment of authentic human feeling in the entire sordid affair. The brutal last hours of Benito Mussolini thus stand as both historical fact and enduring symbol, reminder that no dictator, however powerful, can ultimately escape the judgment of the people they have oppressed. In those final moments at Villa Belmonte, as gunfire echoed across the Italian countryside, the fascist dream died forever, leaving behind only the bitter taste of failure and the eternal warning of history.